So I'm going to continue reading Preventing Violence by James Gilligan. This is an educational, and I'm using my laptop, so hopefully it will last this time. I use the terms disease, illness, and pathology to refer to any force or process within an organism or species that tends to bring death or disability to the organism or extinction to the species. Violence in all the forms just mentioned is, by that definition, a manifestation, form, or symptom of pathology or illness, at least as much as cancer and heart disease are. For it is a force or process within members of the human species that tends to bring death, disability, and potentially even extinction to them. Even self-extinction. This is true even though defensive violence can be a means, and in some circumstances may be the only means, of saving one's life or the lives of other potential victims of an aggressor. But if defensive violence can save life, how can it also be a symptom of pathology or illness? The answer is that it is a symptom of the pathology of the aggressor. It is caused and made necessary by the aggressor's behavior. The aggressor's violence meets my definition of pathology. It not only tends to bring injury or death to the victim, it also increases the risk of injury or death to the perpetrator, whose aggression is likely to provoke violence from the people being attacked. Those who live by the sword die by the sword, and usually at a younger age than those who are not habitually violent, shown by the repeated and hardly surprising observation that the lifespan of recurrently violent people is, on average, shorter than that of nonviolent ones. That is, in fact, one of the most direct forms of evidence that violence is a manifestation of disease. It shortens the lifespan on average, just as other diseases do, and it therefore conforms to my definition of disease. Preventing aggressive violence means preventing both forms of violence. We prevent defensive violence whenever we prevent aggressive violence. This book on preventing violence can be considered as a sequel to my earlier book, 1996, in which I discussed the causes of violence. It is the completion of the project that I began with that book. The first and most efficient step towards learning how to prevent any health problem is, when at all possible, to discover what causes it, so that we know what causes need to be removed or neutralized. In the first few chapters, I will recapitulate the conclusions regarding the causes of violence that I discussed at greater length in my earlier book. Once we know the causes, we can apply that knowledge to the issue of prevention in a very direct way, namely by learning what we have been doing that causes violence so that we will know what to stop doing. Implicit in this is the conclusion that violence does not occur spontaneously or without a cause. It only occurs when somebody does something that causes it. Therefore, all we need to do to prevent violence is to stop doing what we have been doing to cause it. If that idea seems strange at first, I would suggest that this is primarily because the causes of violence have not been sufficiently clearly recognized up to now. Like all illnesses, violence is caused by the interaction between biological, psychological, and social determinants. A point that has important implications for prevention, namely, since there are multiple causes, there can also be multiple forms of prevention. The basis of the public health approach is the distinction between the three levels of prevention: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary prevention refers to interventions that are applied to entire populations, regardless of their current health or relative risk of future illness. An example would be the discovery 150 years ago that cleaning up the water supply in the sewer system was far more effective in protecting the entire population against certain infectious diseases than all the doctors, medicines, and hospitals in the world. It has also been shown that reductions in absolute poverty, raising populations above the subsistence level, and once this has been achieved, reductions in relative poverty, achieving greater equality of wealth and income, have been far more responsible for the dramatic decreases in death rates and increases in longevity that have occurred over the past 2 centuries than improvements in medical treatment. It is still true, even in developed nations such as the UK and the US, that decreasing the degree of economic inequity between the rich and the poor is more effective in improving the health and longevity of the entire population than money spent on medical and surgical treatments. The US, for example, has the largest gaps in income and wealth between the rich and the poor of any developed country. One result of which is that even though it spends twice as much on healthcare as any of the others, it has among the lowest average life expectancies and the highest incidence of several major health problems. Exactly the same principles apply to the prevention of violence. I will summarize in Chapter 5 a number of social, economic, and political policies that have been shown to be far more effective in both absolute and relative cost-effectiveness terms in protecting the population against epidemics of violence than all the police, prisons, and punishments in the world. These are the principles of the primary prevention of violence. Secondary prevention consists of interventions that are aimed at these subgroups in the population that are at higher than average risk of a particular illness, although they have not yet developed any actual symptoms or disabilities. Examples from preventative medicine would be intervening to lower high serum cholesterol or high blood pressure before the people being treated have had heart attacks or strokes. In Chapter 6, I'll summarize some of the programs that have been shown to result in statistically significant reductions in the development of future violent behavior in people who are at a higher than average risk of both being victimized by violence and of committing it themselves, but who have not yet been involved in any serious violence compared with otherwise identical groups who have not had access to those programs. Groups that are at a higher than average risk include, for example, children of unmarried, uneducated, poverty-stricken teenage mothers, survivors of child abuse or other family violence, people addicted to alcohol, residents of high crime neighborhoods, people who are uneducated and unskilled, high school students after school lets out, and people who involve themselves in one way or another with the illegal drug trade. Tertiary prevention refers to clinical medicine as opposed to preventative medicine per se. It consists of the medical treatments or therapies that are given to those who have already become clinically ill with a particular illness. In other words, the treatments provided to sick people by doctors through medicines and surgical procedures in clinics and hospitals. Why is treatment called prevention? Because its goal is to prevent an acute illness from becoming chronic or even fatal, and also to prevent the illness from spreading to people who do not yet have it, in the case of contagious diseases. When we apply these concepts to the study of violence, we can see that the places where the tertiary prevention of violence is pursued are the criminal courts and the system of police, prisons, and punishments, which traditionally have become involved only after someone has already become violent. I will discuss in Chapter 7 the kinds of programs and policies that have been demonstrated to work, and just as importantly, the ones that have been shown to fail in both inpatient settings and outpatient settings. I will also discuss the concept of anti-prison as a radical replacement for traditional models of prison design and practice and the reasons for recommending it. Tertiary prevention is only needed when primary and secondary prevention have failed. Indeed, the need for tertiary prevention only exists to the degree that we have failed to provide sufficient primary and secondary prevention. The fact that there is a need for tertiary prevention at all is a sign of that failure. The old saying that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure is demonstrably true. Applied to the subject of violence, we could say that an ounce of primary and secondary prevention are worth a megaton of cure. One of the major mistakes that both the medical healthcare system and the criminal justice system in the United States have made is to have invested far more money in personnel in tertiary than in primary and secondary prevention. For example, the U.S., the only developed nation that does not provide universal free health care for all of its citizens, lags far behind even many third world countries in rates of immunization of our children, and we lag behind every other developed nation in providing adequate prenatal care to expectant mothers, with the entirely predictable result that we spend many more billions of dollars in the often ineffective attempt to rescue premature babies than we would need to spend on providing much less expensive and far more effective prenatal care. As a result, the U.S. not only spends twice as high a percentage of its gross national product on health care as every other developed nation does, but also has higher rates of maternal and infant mortality and morbidity. Exactly the same principle applies to the approach of violence in the U.S. The punishment and or rehabilitation of those who have already been so damaged that they have become violent is also far more expensive and less effective than preventing violence in the first place, and it causes far more suffering, not only to the perpetrators but also to the victims. We spend incomparably more money on police, prisons, punishments, and criminal courts than we do on providing the kinds of community services that have been demonstrated to achieve equal reductions in criminal violence for 1/5 of the price. As our prisons have become more and more crowded and costly, the waiting lists in our substance abuse centers have become longer and longer, despite the fact, or rather, as I will argue in the final chapter of this book, because of the fact that treatment is at least 5 times more effective than imprisonment, dollar for dollar, in preventing both substance abuse and the property crimes and violence associated with substance abuse. The point that I'm making is that these policies are neither in our rational self-interest, nor are they defensible even in the moral terms in which they are usually defended. Concern for victims, for the taxpayer, for law and order, for diminishing the harm done by drugs, for they only defeat us in our effort to achieve those ostensible goals. In that sense, the failure of the U.S. criminal justice policies bears an eerie resemblance to the failure of our healthcare policies. Just as we spend more on health than any other developed nation and achieve worse results, so we spend more on our criminal justice system and also achieve worse results, in fact, dramatically worse. For example, our imprisonment rates are 5 to 10 times higher than those of any other developed nation, and our death rates from murder are also 5 to 10 times higher. And I'll stop here and mention also that here in Detroit, we live across the river from Windsor, who has almost a 0 crime rate and almost a 0 murder rate. So it's strange that these problems can exist in this culture, and yet in the Canadian culture right across the river, literally, people leave their doors unlocked. They have just as many guns as we do, but they don't use them like we do. So these are culture differences and differences in governmental policy and treatment that essentially create schisms, and that's where we're at. Now, what are the practical implications of applying the tripartite model of preventative medicine to the problem of violence? The first is that there are many different approaches to preventing violence, all of which help and all of which are worth pursuing. Unfortunately, the more powerful and efficient, cost-effective they are, the more they are opposed by powerful political and economic forces, which is the major reason why violence continues to be such a major unsolved problem, especially in the US and the developing world. For example, the political forces that oppose redistribution of wealth and income in the United States, not to mention the world as a whole, are much more powerful than those that support it, notwithstanding or perhaps in part of because of the fact that no policy has been found to be more effective in preventing violence. Does that mean we cannot do anything unless or until the political climate changes? The implication of the tripartite model of prevention that I am presenting here, which is simply the classical model of preventive medicine throughout the world, is that if you cannot implement one form of preventative medicine, you can implement another. In other words, if one or more of the strategies that I've listed under the category of primary prevention prove to be politically unfeasible for the foreseeable future, as I suspect almost all of them are at this point at the beginning of the third millennium, then we can always turn to those that might be more politically feasible now, including those categorized as secondary or tertiary. And if and when the various primary prevention strategies become more politically viable, they can again be pursued. But there is never a point at which we need to be so paralyzed as to do nothing. Another implication is that the prevention of violence is not an all or nothing matter. As with preventative medicine in general, success is almost always a matter of degree. Some illnesses, such as smallpox, it is true, have been completely eradicated throughout the world, and others, such as polio, in most developed countries. But even when we have not succeeded to that degree, anytime we reduce the incidence of a disease even partially, we have prevented all the cases of it that would have otherwise occurred. The same applies to violence, which is why the title of this book, Preventing Violence, is not meant to imply that we have to eradicate all violence in order to speak of having prevented some of it. On the other hand, I see no reason to rule out in advance the possibility of preventing at least the most dangerous and destructive forms of violence more or less completely, rather than merely reducing them. One reason I say that is because a few remarkable societies, if very few, but the fact that they exist at all shows that it is possible, have in fact succeeded in preventing virtually all lethal and life-threatening violence, as I will discuss in Chapter 5. And I will maintain that there is, in principle, no reason why we could not do the same thing on a worldwide basis, which is not at all the same as predicting that we will do it. The reason that there's a difference between what we could do and what we may, in fact, do instead is because preventing violence is not the only goal or even the main goal that many people want to pursue. There are costs we'd have to pay and benefits we would have to sacrifice in order even to attempt to prevent serious or lethal violence virtually completely, and we still might not know if our attempts were going to be successful until we'd already paid a very heavy price. Violence brings very real advantages to many people, as I will discuss in the final chapter. It is not surprising that many would oppose the adoption of policies that would reduce the rates of violence. Now let's think about that. If there is an agenda to depopulate, based on the fact that people believe that the population growth is unsustainable for the planet, which I don't believe it is if we are living in conjunction with Mother Earth instead of raping and pillaging and destroying her. I think that population control is unnecessary. I realize that to many people, the idea that we know how to prevent violence at all, let alone the major and most destructive forms of it, may sound optimistic to the point of being utopian. That would be a misunderstanding of what I'm saying for two reasons. A question of human survival. The first is that I'm not talking about a utopia, I'm talking about survival. I'm suggesting that learning how to prevent violence, not just slightly, but far more successfully than we have to now, is not an option, a luxury, which we may decide that we cannot afford or that is not worth the price. Learning how to prevent violence is an absolute prerequisite for human survival during the coming century, the coming millennium, and the coming millennia. There may well be many different ways to succeed at this, and we already know that there are many different ways to fail. We have tried and are still trying many of the latter. But the research I will present in this book tends to support the conclusion that even though there may be a variety of potentially successful strategies for preventing violence, they are likely to have certain core principles in common, so that the variety of options may be compared to variations on a theme. And within the range of potentially successful options, it may well be that none would represent the kind of society that some people, even many people, would consider their idea of a utopia. But that is irrelevant to the point that I'm making in this book. I'm not designing a utopia, and not merely because one person's utopia is likely to be another's dystopia. I'm talking about certain minimal characteristics that a society must possess in order not to self-destruct. And that is a very different and much less optimistic question than how to construct a utopia. The second point is that I'm not at all optimistic with regard to the likelihood that we will in fact mobilize the political will to do the things that I believe we would need to do in order to prevent further increasingly genocidal catastrophes. When I say I'm not optimistic about that, I do not mean that I pretend to know that it will happen. I simply mean that I see no basis for making the assumption that it will not. Japan and the nations of Western Europe had to go through unimaginable horrors before they mobilized the political will to make the radical changes in their political and economic systems that have enabled them, for the half-century since the end of the last World War, to prevent wars among themselves completely and to prevent individual murders within their societies more completely than any other large-scale civilizations in history. This they could only do by eliminating both poverty and dictatorship from their societies. The inequities of wealth and power that are among the main factors that lead men and nations to start wars and commit murders more completely than any previous nations in history. Will the U.S., together with the rest of the developed and developing world, have to go through even more unimaginable horrors before we mobilize the collective political will to make the massive changes on a worldwide scale that will be necessary in order to prevent increasingly unsurvivable wars and genocidal massacres? I do not pretend to know the answer to that question. I will only say that whoever has the confidence, the optimism, and the utopianism to answer it in the negative must know something that I do not. We have, for all practical purposes, eradicated some forms of violence completely, at least in most places most of the time, such as cannibalism and slavery. Well, I would not even count slavery because I believe that we are all modern-day slaves if we are poor. And a few remarkable small-scale societies, as I will discuss in Chapter 5, have succeeded in almost totally eradicating the major forms of lethal violence, such as murder and war, for decades or even centuries. But the major question that confronts us now is not whether we can be successful as those societies have been in preventing violence. It is whether we can learn to prevent enough of it to ensure the survival of our societies themselves. To say that we need to prevent violence if we are going to survive is altogether different from predicting that we will survive. And describing the steps we will need to take if we want to prevent violence is altogether different from saying that we will take those steps. My purpose in this book is neither to attempt to predict the future, nor to tell other people what they should do. It is simply to summarize what our choices are and to mention that each of those choices has costs and benefits so that people can choose what they want with as much knowledge as possible of what they are choosing, what it is likely to cost them, and what they will get in return. I'm hoping that some of the lessons I have learned from years of work devoted to preventing violence within the most violent institutions and among the most violent individuals and groups in our society, my laboratory for the study of violence, can prove to be relevant and helpful to us in our attempt to understand what we can do and will need to do in order to prevent violence wherever it occurs, on whatever scale and in whatever contexts, from homicide and suicide to terrorism and race riots to war and genocide. I believe that there are certain causes or motives that are common to all forms of violence, so that there are also certain principles of prevention that are common to all. And this is why I'm reading this, because if you have this information, you can apply it whenever and wherever and however you believe is necessary. And so that's why I feel like I'm compelled to do this painstaking reading aloud on YouTube, so that anybody who wants to have this information, even if they don't have the money to purchase this book, can still have this information and be educated and be able to use this stuff. I've attempted to write this book not as a philosopher or a moralist telling people how they should live, but as a physician and a natural scientist describing how we can live. That is, which strategies for living, and that means living together, for we are a social species, succeed in sustaining life, that is, preventing violence, and which ones lead to death by violence. Darwin wrote about the origin of the species, all species. I am writing about how to avoid the extinction of a species, our species. I believe that General MacArthur was profoundly correct and far-sighted when he said that the ultimate outcome of modern war in this era of thermonuclear weapons was mutual total annihilation. It is ironic that he of all people should have said that, given that he was the same general whom President Truman had to relieve of his command in Korea because he was unwilling to settle for a limited war, even implying that we should not rule out the use of atomic bombs. Was he motivated to warn us about the dangers of modern weapons because he came so close to using them? Many thinkers have recognized for a long time now that if we do not eliminate war, war will eliminate us. Preventing violence, then, is simply the necessary prerequisite for the survival of our species. It is a project of evolutionary significance. All right, Chapter 1, Shame and the Death of the Self. In the course of my psychotherapeutic work with violent criminals, I was surprised to discover that I kept getting the same answer when I asked one man after another why he had assaulted or even killed someone. Because he disrespected me. In fact, they used that phrase so often that they abbreviated it to, he dissed me. Whenever people use a word so often that they abbreviate it, you know how central it is in their moral and emotional vocabulary. References to the desire for respect as the motive for violence kept recurring with remarks like, I never got so much respect before in my life as I did when I first pointed a gun at some dude's face. On another occasion, I could not understand why one of the prisoners was engaged in a running battle with the prison officers that resulted in his finally being sentenced to solitary confinement and having every privilege and possession taken away from him. I asked him, what do you want so badly that you are willing to give up everything else in order to get it? Because it seemed to me that that was exactly what he had done. In response, this man, who was usually so inarticulate that it was difficult to get a clear answer to any question, astonished me by standing up tall, looking me in the eye, and replying with perfect clarity, pride, dignity, self-esteem. And then he described how the officers were, he felt, attempting to take away his last shred of pride and self-respect by disrespecting him, and said, if you ain't got pride, you got nothing. This experiences and many others like them convinced me that the basic psychological motive or cause of violent behavior is the wish to ward off or eliminate the feeling of shame and humiliation, a feeling that is painful and can even be intolerable and overwhelming, and replace it with its opposite, the feeling of pride. I will use these two terms, shame and pride, as generic terms to refer to two whole families of feelings. Synonyms for pride include self-esteem, self-love, self-respect, feelings of self-worth, dignity, and the sense of having maintained one's honor intact. But pride must be in much shorter supply than shame, because there are literally dozens of synonyms for shame, including feelings of being slighted, insulted, disrespected, dishonored, disgraced, disdained, slandered, treated with contempt, ridiculed, teased, taunted, mocked, rejected, defeated, subjected to indignity or ignominy, feelings of inferiority, inadequacy, incompetency, feelings of being weak, ugly, a failure, losing face, being treated as if you were insignificant, unimportant, or worthless, or any of the numerous other forms of what psychoanalysts call narcissistic injuries. As Franz Alexander wrote in some comments, the psychology of narcissism is the psychology of shame and its equivalent, feelings of inferiority. Envy and jealousy are members of the same family of feelings. People feel inferior to those whom they envy or of whom they are jealous. People become indignant, and many become violent when they suffer an indignity. Language itself reveals the link between shame and rage. In my previous book, I spoke of shame as the pathogen that causes violence, just as specifically as the tubercle bacillus causes tuberculosis, except that in the case of violence, it is an emotion, not a microbe, the emotion of shame and humiliation. It is because this emotion is so powerful and pervasive and so central to the experience of many people, especially those who are predisposed to violence, that there are so many synonyms for it, just as the Japanese and the Chinese have dozens of words for different varieties of silk and silkworms because of the centrality of these in their culture. When I first realized what I was hearing from the violent men I was working with, I began to think that I had discovered something original, something previously unknown. Then I happened to reread a passage in the Bible, the story of the first recorded murder in Western history, that I had read many times before without actually understanding what it was saying. It had never been clear to me why Cain killed Abel. But having sat down and talked with people who actually committed murders and asking them why, I was at last able to hear what the story of Cain and Abel was saying. The Bible makes it very clear why Cain killed Abel. The Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain he had not respect. In other words, God dissed Cain, or rather Cain was dissed because of Abel. And he acted out his anger over this insult in exactly the same way as the murderers with whom I was working. As I read further, I began to realize that this insight has been expressed centuries and even millennia ago, not only in the great myths of our tradition, but also in the writings of the great philosophers and theologians. Both Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, for example, stated very clearly that the cause of the desire to assault or injure others is the anger that is caused by feeling that they have been slighted by them, and therefore feel justified in getting revenge for the slight. Both of those thinkers make it clear that what they mean by slighting is exactly what I'm describing here: insulting, ridiculing, disdaining, dishonoring. In short, any behavior that shames people by treating them with contempt and disrespect as though they are unimportant or insignificant. In other words, the hypothesis regarding the psychological cause or motivation of violence that I thought I had originated has been around in one form or another for a very long time. On the other hand, if it's a valid hypothesis, it would be surprising if earlier thinkers had not also discovered the same thing. For after all, violence has been with us since the dawn of history, and it would be surprising if the greatest minds and the most perceptive observers in history had not also noticed the same regularities in human behavior. More recent examples would include Hegel, who identified the desire for recognition as the central motive force behind all human history. Recognition is a synonym for respect, which means literally to be looked back at, respectare, which is the root word, or recognized. So it is also a synonym for honor, pride, attention, and all other forms of narcissistic gratification. And history itself, as Hegel and many other philosophers of history have noted, is largely the history of violence, wars, assassinations, revolutions, and so on. Although Marx turned Hegel on his head, as he put it, he agreed with him to the extent of noting that shame is the emotion of revolution. Shame being the emotion people feel when they are not recognized or respected. So these are very powerful roots that we're discussing here. And they're so very relevant to today and the things that are going on today. The same conclusion as to the psychological cause of violence has also been reached by contemporary scholars from the whole range of the behavioral sciences: clinical psychoanalysis, experimental psychology, social learning theory, sociology, anthropology, criminology, even law enforcement. The psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut, for example, wrote, "The deepest level to which psychoanalysis can penetrate when it traces destructiveness is to the presence of a serious narcissistic injury, an injury that threatened the cohesion of the self." And that quote is from The Restoration of the Self, 1977. Another analyst, Gregory Rocklin, made the same point when he emphasized the relation of injured narcissism to aggression and of humiliation to violence, and concluded, "The question is, what makes people so prone to feeling vulnerable and humiliated, and therefore ultimately what causes violence?" That excerpt is from Man's Aggression, 1973. Herbert Thomas, in Experiencing a Shame Response, 95, schematized the steps leading up to an act of violence as beginning with a rejection, which elicits intensely painful feelings of shame, to which the person responds with anger, which he then expresses or acts out with an act of violence. Experimental psychologists have reached the same conclusion. Many individual studies and several reviews of the published research literature have been devoted to the study of aggressive behavior and simulated violence elicited under experimental conditions in psychological laboratories. These concern, for example, experiments in which an attempt is made to induce the subject to press a button that he is told will administer painful and potentially injurious or even lethal electric shocks to another person, which is the famous I can't remember the name of it, but people know what it is. The consensus that has emerged from this work is that the most potent stimulus of aggression and violence, and the one that is most reliable in eliciting this response, is not frustration per se, as the frustration-aggression hypothesis had claimed, but rather insult and humiliation. In other words, the most effective way and often the only way to provoke someone to become violent is to insult him. Feshbach, in The Dynamics and Morality of Violence and Aggression, 1971, for example, after reviewing the literature on this subject, concluded that violations to self-esteem through insult, humiliation, or coercion are probably the most important source of anger and aggressive drive in humans. It should be stressed that coercion as a violation of autonomy also produces feelings of shame. As Erik Erikson stressed, pride is dependent on being independent. Geen, in Effects of Frustration, 1968, concluded that personal insult was more powerful in provoking aggressive behavior than frustration. Sabini, in another review of the literature, generalized, "Frustration per se does not lead to anger. If frustration is not the cause of anger, what is?" According to Aristotle, the perception that one has been insulted leads to anger. Curiously, when psychologists have tried to produce anger in the laboratory, even when they have written about their results in terms of the consequences of frustration, they have not relied very much on frustrating people, but have much more commonly insulted people, possibly because it is very difficult to make adults angry just by frustrating them. The only situation in which frustration without deliberate insult was found to elicit anger was when the frustration was unjustified. For example, a bus driver deliberately bypassing a bus stop. This does not constitute an exception to the principle that anger and violence are caused by feeling shamed. However, for the perception that one has been a victim of injustice elicits feelings of shame over being valued so little by the other person or establishment, and for being too weak to make him treat one fairly, which is why Marx's insight into the motivation for violent revolution mentioned above makes psychological sense. In fact, the Latin word for injustice, ineria, also means insult as well as injury. One does not need to add insult to injury or to injustice. It is already contained within both of those experiences, as it is in the words used to refer to them. The perception that one has been a perpetrator of injustice, by contrast, elicits feelings of guilt. A number of sociologists have arrived at the same explanation of the psychological roots of human violence. Thomas Scheff and Suzanne Retzinger, for example, in Emotions and Violence, 91, wrote that a particular sequence of emotions underlies all destructive aggression. Shame is first evoked, which leads to rage and then violence. The criminologist David Luckenbill in Criminal Homicide, 1977, analyzed the step-by-step escalation of the confrontations between victim and perpetrator that led to all 70 murders that occurred in one California county over a 10-year period of 63 to 72, and found that in all cases the murderer had interpreted his violence as the only means by which to save or maintain face, and to demonstrate that his character was strong rather than weak, and in a situation that he interpreted as casting doubt on that assessment of himself. The opening move that started this process was some behavior by the victim that the perpetrator interpreted as insulting or disparaging to him, and that would cause him to lose face if he backed down rather than responding with violence, even when the victim was only a child who refused to stop crying when ordered to. Whew. Another sociologist, Elijah Anderson, has been conducting ethnographic fieldwork in ghetto areas of Philadelphia for many years, studying the causes of violence currently devastating many urban neighborhoods. He discovered that the street culture has evolved a code of the street, which amounts to a set of informal rules of behavior organized around a desperate search for respect that governs public social relations, especially violence. At the heart of the code is the issue of respect, loosely defined as being treated right or being granted one's proper due, or the deference one deserves. Respect is viewed as almost an external entity, one that is hard won but easily lost, and so must constantly be guarded. Something extremely valuable on the street, respect, is at stake in every interaction. For people unfamiliar with the code, this concern with respect in the most ordinary interactions can be frightening and incomprehensible. Many feel that it is acceptable to risk dying over issues of respect. There is a general sense that very little respect is to be had, and therefore everyone competes to get what affirmation he can from what is available. The resulting craving for respect gives people thin skins and short fuses. All this occurs against the background of life among the ghetto poor who suffer the absence of jobs that pay a living wage and the stigma of racial discrimination. He adds that in a society where so much economic inequality exists, for the severely alienated and desperate, a gun can become like a bank card, an equalizer, in the contest for respect, and for the material status symbols that serve as one of the main bases of respect. Nor is it only behavioral scientists and academicians who have reached these conclusions. The same findings have been reported by law enforcement officers who have investigated the motives of murderers and other violent criminals. John Douglas was a profiler with the FBI whose career was devoted to studying the personalities and attempting to discern the motives of the most violent and dangerous criminals in the United States. What he concluded was that any ultimate violent act is the result of a deep-seated feeling of inadequacy, and that these men attempt to diminish their low self-esteem by blaming others for their own real or imagined shortcomings, which were often caused, he discovered, by the way they were treated by overly authoritarian fathers. The degree to which a person experiences feelings of shame depends on two variables: the way other people are treating him with admiration and respect, or with contempt and disdain, and the degree to which he himself already feels proud or ashamed. The more a person is shamed by others from childhood, by parents or peers who ridicule or reject him, the more he is likely to feel chronically shamed and hypersensitive to feelings and experiences of being shamed, sometimes to the point of feeling that others are treating him with contempt or disdain even when they are not. For such people, and they are the rule among the violent, even a minor sign of real or imagined disrespect can trigger a homicidal reaction. The purpose of violence is to force respect from other people. The less self-respect people feel, the more they are dependent on respect from others, for without a certain minimal amount of respect from others or the self begins to feel dead inside, numb and empty. That is how the most violent criminals told me they felt, and it is clear that it is the most intolerable of all feelings, though it is actually an absence of feeling, lack of the feeling of pride or self-love. When people lack self-respect, and feel that they are incapable of eliciting respect from others in the form of admiration for their achievements or their personalities, they may see no way to get respect except in the form of fear, which I think of as a kind of ersatz substitute for admiration. And violence does elicit fear as it is intended to. For example, I've spoken to many violent criminals who spoke of how gratifying it was to see fear in the eyes of their victims. All right, I'm going to take a break here and post this up, and I will post up part 4 shortly.